Welcome, everybody, to our program on marking the 10th anniversary of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, strengthening economic and technology ties. We are so pleased to have an all-star lineup here tonight. We have our very own Wendy Cutler, Vice President at our Policy Institute, who is here from Washington, D.C., and Korea's former Trade Minister, Jong-Hoon Kim, who is here from Seoul, and they are going to be formally introduced by our moderator, James Green, in just a moment. Welcome to our Honorary Chair, Ken Wilcox, our board members, and our Advisory Council, our Groundbreaker and Innovator members. We appreciate your support of our mission of navigating a shared future. We are also very, very grateful to the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea for partnering with us for this program and for being such wonderful collaborators. You've been terrific friends. The Korean consulate was the first to introduce to us these KF94 special masks at the beginning of the pandemic, and we did not realize at the time how valuable these would be, so thank you very much. You may have also noticed when you came into the Palace Hotel, the U.S. and the Korean flag at the front entrance. That's the work behind the scenes of the consulate. Amazing. Thank you very much. The team is right here. I'd also like to give a special welcome to the delegation that has traveled here with Wendy Cutler. Wendy is running a tremendous program on emerging female leaders, and there are 6 of them in the audience with us today. The program is called Building Trade Ties with Korea's Emerging Female Leaders. This is thanks to the Korea Foundation, and Wendy is taking them on an amazing whirlwind tour of Washington, D.C., New York. They're here in San Francisco today, and tomorrow they're going to be in Silicon Valley. They spent the day with Mark Chandler at City Hall this afternoon. Thank you, Mark. They are our future trade negotiators, so our hope is with them for future decades. Would you please stand, the 6 of you? Welcome. They're fascinating women selected by, of course, Wendy Cutler. If you have a chance to say hi to them, please do. Our format for today, I'll introduce the Consul General of Korea in San Francisco, Sangsoo Yoon, and our moderator, James Green. Consul General Yoon will say a few words, and then James is going to lead us in a moderated discussion with Wendy and Minister Kim. Towards the end of the program, you will have a chance to ask questions. If you are called on, first of all, please raise your hand. Then wait for the microphone to come to you. Introduce yourself before you ask your question. We have an hour for this program. We'll wrap at 6:30. This event is on the record. We are recording. The video will be available in about a week on our website. Full speaker bios are on our website. To get started, a few words about Consul General Yoon and our moderator, James Green. Sangsoo Yoon has been Consul General here in San Francisco since November 2020. Before that, and he's done a number of things, but these are the highlights. He was a Consul General in Sydney. He worked as the Minister for the Embassy in Malaysia. He was the first secretary of the Korean Permanent Mission to the UN office in Switzerland. He's held numerous positions in Korea in trade and policy and economic cooperation, and he also went to Georgetown Law in D.C. Our moderator, James Green, is a longtime friend of Asia Society. He is now at Google as Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy, where he covers international policy for the company's hardware business. For 2 decades before that, he worked on U.S.-Asia relations for the U.S. government and in the private sector. He was based in Beijing with USTR, ran the Government Relations Department at the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. So thank you both very, very much for participating and speaking. Please welcome, first up, Consul General Yoon.
Members of Asia Society, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to make a remark on today's event titled Making the 10th Anniversary of Korea-U.S. FTA, Strengthening Economic and Technology Ties. In commemorating 10th anniversary of free trade agreement between the Republic of Korea and the United States of America. First of all, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude Ms. Margaret Corney, the Executive Director of Asian Society, Northern California, and her team. The Korean Consulate General has been working very closely with the Asian Society by organizing seminars together virtually, even during the pandemic. This time, we made this seminar in person. And I really appreciate Asian Society for co-organizing this wonderful event. My special thanks also goes to Minister Jong-Hoon Kim, the former Trade Minister for the Republic of Korea, and Ms. Wendy Cutler, the former acting Deputy USTR, who were the actually chief negotiator from both Korea and U.S. respectively during the KORUS FTA negotiation. I really appreciate both of you for sharing your experience and insight with us as a main speaker of today. And I also would like to thank Mr. James Green, the Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google, for taking a very important role as a moderator. Minister Kim was actually my mentor and very outspoken leader for Korean trade liberalization. He's now admired by Korean public for his vision and accomplishment as a trade minister. Even though he is quite busy with the new roles as a board member in SK Innovation and the Korean Sports and Olympic Committee, he accepted this invitation to this dialogue and flew back to San Francisco, where he served a long time ago, almost 18 years ago, as a Consul General back in 2002 to 2004. We welcome you back to San Francisco. Welcome. Distinguished guests, before jumping into the main topic, I would like to draw your attention to the historic background of this Palace Hotel in relation to Korea and U.S. relation. The Palace Hotel San Francisco is a very special place where the Korea and U.S. relation has started 140 years ago. On September 2nd, 1883, the Korean King's special envoy, called in Korean language Bobingsa, arrived in the port of San Francisco. The gentleman in Korean traditional attire, the hanbok, was very covered by the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper at the time. And the delegation checked in the Palace Hotel, where we are right now. They were the first Korean government delegation visiting the United States after the Korea-U.S. agreement. That is called the Treaty of Peace and Amity, Commerce and Navigation, Korea-United States Treaty of 1882, which opened the Korean market and Korean society to international world. And the delegation left on September 7th, 1883, and arrived in New York and met with the then U.S. President Chester Arthur. So it is the first encounter between the Korean official delegation with the U.S. government officers at that time. So in this regard, I'm very much delighted to have today's seminar in this remarkable venue, which reminds us the first ever Korean government delegation in San Francisco. Distinguished guests, on March 15th, 2012, a historic agreement, the Korea-U.S. FTA, came into effect. When the two countries began negotiation the KORUS FTA in 2006, the expectation was that the negotiation would go rather quickly. But it would ultimately take more than 60 years of negotiation, debate, and some delay before the KORUS FTA would be approved and implemented by both governments. In the end, the FTA became a win-win agreement that not only promotes trade and investment economically, but also maximize the capability of our manufacturing and services sector, which have mutual strengths. In addition, the FTA has greatly contributed to elevating bilateral relations from traditionally security-based alliance to a more comprehensive economic alliance. And the KORUS FTA played a pivotal role in helping the two countries achieve the largest trade volume in history, which is the amount of 169 billion US dollar last year. The Korea-U.S. FTA is fulfilling its role as a trade facilitator and promoter, even in a very difficult period of pandemic, and also making the Korean economy to become an advanced one, ranking the 10th largest economy around the world. Distinguished guests, just 11 days after our new Korean President Yoon inauguration in May, the ROK and U.S. summit took place in Seoul, and the two leaders laid out a clear vision for enhancing our alliance into a global, comprehensive strategic alliance. And this new alliance includes not only strengthening our security alliance, but also evolving into economic and technological alliance. So KORUS FTA is our important layer for promoting our trade and investment, and this historic framework, which celebrates 10th anniversary this year, has served to promote bilateral trade and investment relations. Ladies and gentlemen, the Korea-U.S. alliance is robust and even strengthened during the time of hardship. The two countries have made continued joint effort in the areas including economy, national security, and regional peace and health and environmental issues. So even the pandemic has not stopped our mutual cooperation, and the ironclad alliance between our both countries now have upgraded to the comprehensive strategic alliance. Having said that, I think today's seminar is very meaningful and important for promoting our two countries' alliance, and it is my great pleasure to have Minister Kim and Deputy USTR, former Deputy Minister, Deputy USTR Wendy Cutler, having this very important venue. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Consul General Yoon, thank you for that history and that very kind introduction. Thank you, Margaret, the Society of Northern California. Really a pleasure and an honor to be on stage with two folks who devoted their life to public service. Really want to get to the meat of it. I'll just touch on their biography briefly, and then we'll get to lessons learned 10 years later after the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Wendy Cutler, who's the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of their Washington, D.C. office. She focuses, thank you.
Is that me beeping? Thank you. Can you guys hear me all right? Wendy's the Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of the D.C. office. She focuses on leading initiatives that address challenges related to trade, investment, and innovation, as well as women's empowerment, as we heard for the delegations he's leading here today. Prior to joining the Asia Society Policy Institute, she had nearly 3 decades in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, rising to be the acting deputy USTR. I would say, on a personal note, I've known Wendy for at least a decade and a half. It's really been a pleasure to work with you through all your iterations. One of her kind of crowning achievements that made her famous in Korea was the lead negotiator for the Korea FTA, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Such a pleasure to have her here. And then Minister Kim. She's a graduate of Georgetown University, which I don't think is in your bio, but very important fact, given we have some Hoyas in the room. Minister Kim is a Yonsei University graduate, as a career diplomat with 38 years of experience in the Foreign Service and on trade issues, with postings in Washington, here in San Francisco. Welcome back, Minister Kim. Great to have you here. As well as Geneva, Canada, France, Burkina Faso, among other places. He was the chief negotiator on the Korean side for the U.S.-Korea FTA, and he is now an independent director of the board of SK Innovation and chairman, I believe. So wonderful to have you back. Maybe one way I could get the conversation started, for those of us who are not from Washington, could you just explain a little bit about what a trade agreement is, and then I'll ask you more detail about the U.S.-Korea FTA and some of the negotiations. But how do you define a trade agreement these days? And then I'll get to some of the details of your experience in the FTA. Maybe I can start with you, Wendy, and then Minister Kim.
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much for everyone for showing up. This is one of the first in-person events I've done since COVID, so bear with us, including this noise we're hearing.
I don't hear any noise.
You don't hear? It's just me? Okay. But thanks to Margaret Conley, to Ambassador Yoon, and just a special shout out to the women that have joined me here in San Francisco from Korea. One of the reasons I became so interested in mentoring and supporting women in trade in Korea is because when I worked with Minister Kim, guess what? We would sit across the table from each other, and he had all men with him. And I had, my delegation was more diverse. There were a couple of women, including a woman who recently became the first female trade minister of Korea. But for the most part, it was men. But it's changing in Korea. More and more women are entering the ministries, joining the ranks, and becoming trade negotiators. And I think it's great to see. And, I love mentoring them, hearing their stories, and exposing them to as much as possible in the United States, meeting with accomplished women, former USTR negotiators, and trying to be mentors and developing a network for them as they advance in their careers. So what was the question?
What's a trade agreement?
What's a trade agreement? A trade agreement is basically a pact between two governments to open up their markets. So it sounds like, okay, maybe one page. But in reality, when we were done with the Chorus Agreement, it was probably 500 pages of rules and then another 500 pages of tariff and market access commitments. So these are really, really detailed negotiations dealing with everything from lowering tariffs to strengthening intellectual property protection. They cover almost all sectors in the economy, everything from agriculture to autos to financial services. And then they also cover investment, labor, the environment, competition policy. And so both Minister Kim and I, every time we'd meet in what were called negotiating rounds, we each had about 100 people with us, meeting in separate rooms all over whatever hotel it was. And our job was basically to see if this could all come together. And I always remember that sometimes we would almost feel like firemen, because all day negotiators would come to us, the intellectual property protection negotiators. They'd have a breakdown on some issues, and they'd come to us, and we'd have to solve it. Or, they couldn't agree on textiles or anti-dumping. And so our role as chief negotiators was kind of keep it all together, but also to think of trade-offs between these different areas. Because for these agreements to succeed, they have to be win-win. Both sides have to go home and to be able to say, look what we got. Because if you can't say that, then you can't get the needed domestic support to bring the deal into place. And so, when we were negotiating, we talked about win-win. There were many moments in the negotiations where I felt this is lose-lose and I want to get out of here. But we both persevered. We stuck with it. It took us a while both to get it through our respective legislatures and to put it into effect. But 10 years later, I'm proud to say I think it is a win-win agreement. It's brought benefits both to the United States and to Korea. You can just look at the trade numbers that have exploded between the United States and Korea. The foreign direct investment between our companies has increased substantially. But even more than that, it really added an important economic foundation and pillar to a relationship which was really focused on founded on a security alliance, and it rounded off that relationship. And I'm going to stop now and just say, I think because of that foundation, we find ourselves in a situation now where there's so many opportunities to build on that foundation and to do a lot more in the economic realm together.
Thanks, Wendy. Minister Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Well, Wendy, your comment really bring me back to 15 years ago. Well, we had good times, but many times of controversies and confrontations, a standoff, but again, meet again to narrow down our gaps. First, mentioning about trade agreement. When I come to U.S., we have a round, official round. Then the Korean delegation, the number is almost a plane full of Boeing 747, at least 200 of them. So when we sit together, not all of them sit in one room. We need a big, grand ballroom now. A room like this, but Wendy there and I sit here, and maybe the sub-chief negotiators, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 of them sit behind us. At this former setting, to come closer is really difficult. Whenever I say something good for U.S., then there's some opposition from my rear, sitting that you should stay there, and this is not a good time to make any kind of concession. So the real progress is made when we meet one-on-one. And sometimes we say that non-conversation, but it is really a conversation. But Wendy told me this is non-conversation, right? But at that time, the saying yes or no is really important for me, because even though we named that non-conversation, that is much more important than real conversation. So everything is, every important thing was taking place, when we meet one-on-one, narrowing down the gaps. And that was the role of what chief negotiator played. Having said that, I really thank Asia Society of Northern California and Korean Consul General here for this wonderful gathering. And going back to 15 years, it's not an easy recollection, so I put my memories on several pieces of papers here. But all in all, there was kind of support in many interest groups, particularly from big business in Korea. At the time we start negotiating. But that many people really sometimes took to the street or make some kind of uprising or some, a very strong kind of manifestations protesting against the agenda that, then Korean government tried to carry out. But all in all, in my memories, Wendy and I did our best, and we worked really days and nights, because my days is her nights and her days are my nights, across the Pacific. So we really worked nights and days and nights, and did our best. And that was times when we were much younger than now. But if anyone asks me to do it again, that would be a very, very tall order. I will never do it again. I will never do it again. Well, feeling these days, I really feel lucky myself to have such a chance to work for the national agenda. Not many Korean officials, could have such kind of a chance to work for such kind of significant, national agenda. Of course, at that time, I was really concerned about my own, destination or my own fate, whether I could make it or not. But it is true that I really did my best. And these days, after 10 years of after its entry into force, if you look at whatever kind of statistics, numbers, and figures, both in U.S., in Korea, the numbers, figures are very positive. So as Wendy said, this is a real win-win kind of agreement. Well, I cannot take all the quotations about the numbers, but if you look at the two-way trade in goods, the two-way trade in services, and the amount of investment in both ways, the Korean business companies brought here, and American companies, brought to Korea. So everything was very, very positive. So that's why I can really feel proud. But one funny thing, in later years, these days is during the President Trump's time, President Trump said several times that this pact is bad for U.S., right?
The worst agreement ever.
Right. He said that. And he really threatened to abandon it. And at that time, what was funny to me was some Korean politicians who used to strongly oppose against me said they really respect me now because they say this is bad for U.S., then this means this is good for Korea. So, sometimes, I really realize, how politics can be silly sometimes, if not all times. But anyhow, all in all, that was good.
Minister Kim, I wonder if I could follow up.
Thank you.
I neglected to say that you were the vice minister and then minister, and then you got elected to the National Assembly, so someone who really was able to serve your country in a lot of different ways. Uh-huh. But I hear a lot of talk of win-win, but what we want to hear about was what was the most difficult thing that you dealt with in the negotiation, and then how was it resolved in your recollection? Maybe I can start with you, Minister Kim, and then Wendy, if that's okay.
Okay. I start first? What?
Don't say it was me.
Issue, the most difficult issue, not the person.
Thank you.
No, I was lucky enough, to have my counterpart as Wendy, because we really trusted each other. Because in, complicated negotiations, everything is painful, right? And you need a great deal of endurance and understanding. But the real foremost importance is the trust, mutual trust. And cover up or cheating is something you cannot do if you have a trust. So based on that trust, we can narrow down the gaps and everything. But having said that, the difficulties I experienced is before and during and after negotiation. Before, of course, Korea, as you know well, was liberated by in 1945 from Japanese occupation and followed by Korean War. And by that time, the land was totally devastated. You might have heard some foreign observers said at that time, this country is now totally devastated, and they may need more than 100 years to get reconstructed. So 100 years from then is 2053. Now we are 2022, and Korea is now ranking 10th or 11th, in the world in terms of GDP size. So this is what they call kind of a miracle of Han River. So we may deserve such kind of admiration, but to sit together on a negotiating table, particularly on one-on-one basis, with a super economy which is the U.S., that's challenging. That's not an easy job. So at that time in 2005, when we started, because the negotiation started in 2006, at that time, outstanding pending issues were lifting ban on U.S. beef, which caused by mad cow disease, happened here in 2003. And that was really politically charged in Korea, because we were worrying about kind of trade adjustment measures once we opened for U.S. beef. But the protest and the slogans in the street was, eating U.S. beef, you are dead, because of mad cow disease, with holes in the brains. And such kind of claims and non-scientific kind of slogans were really widespread in Korean public. And that really brought a big damage on early stage of a new president, who was Lee Myung-bak. And that beef was a pending issue in 2005, but before we start our negotiation. Maybe that I will touch on later. And the second one was a screen quota. You remember? Have you ever heard that screen quota? Screen quota means every cinema house in Korea should have a certain days out of 1 year to turn on only Korean films, not foreign films. And at that time, the regulation was 146 days out of 165 days of a year. So that's 40% of the year. You have to run Korean film only. That's what they call screen quota. And U.S. wants us to abolish that. And there was a strong, very vehement protest against that kind of a demand from U.S., particularly from cinema business, including stars and actors, actresses. They have public powers. They are all celebrated. And I really had real, difficult times handling with this problem. But anyhow, Korean government decided to reduce it to the half, which is 76 days. And now that is now enforced. But look at now, the Korean films like Squid Games or Parasite is now worldwide famous films. And Korean actors and actresses, they are the heroes and heroines in film festivals of the world. But that means open and compete is good to raise up your competitiveness. That was the message, Korea Team Korea, including our delegation, try to deliver to the Korean public. Let us open and compete. But, persuaded on that point was not easy. But if you look at, past examples like opening cookies, opening banana market, opening supermarket, every time, whenever there's opening issues, there was reactions from interest groups. And that reaction was not really logic, but very much politically charged, and took to the street. And there was a social turbulences, but Korean government should have tied it over. And what Korea-U.S. agreement was good for us, for Korean economy was, all these kind of tit for tat and kind of measures of Section 301 or Super 301, sometimes a Special 301, kind of implying retaliation from U.S. All these kind of trade disputes has been superseded by trade by rule as we agreed upon in the agreement. That was the good point of a trade agreement.
Wendy, beef, film, those are two good ones.
Yeah, I would just add autos to the list. Probably as the U.S. negotiator, that was the most difficult issue to deal with. In that, one of the most, because beef was difficult, screen quotas was difficult, but autos was very difficult because the auto industry was against this agreement. They worked hard to try and stop this agreement. They very much feared that if we lifted our tariffs, that Korean cars would flood into our market, and that they wouldn't be able to compete. And so throughout the negotiation, almost every round, I had a new proposal to give to Minister Kim, asking for to deal with auto standards, to deal with auto tariffs, to deal with new auto regulations. And it became, it was a very contentious issue. And frankly, once we concluded the original deal in 2007, as you notice, there was a 5-year lag between 2007 and 2012 when this agreement came into place. And I think one of the key reasons, I would say, it was because of, in the U.S., it was because of beef, but also autos. And as a result, when President Obama took office, he instructed us to go back to the negotiating table and try and get, and to get more on autos if we were going to succeed and get this passed by our Congress. And that set of renegotiations in 2010 were very charged and very difficult. Not to put words in your mouth, but in your shoes, you felt like you already gave everything you had to give, and then we were coming back and asking for more, and we didn't want to give you anything more, but you made us give you more, and we did give you more on pork and some other issues that elude me now. And then the agreement came into effect, and then I left USTR in 2015, but again, when President Trump came in to office, he also pinpointed this agreement and instructed my successors to go back to the negotiating table and get even more on autos. And so I think we're done with renegotiations. I don't think either side could probably stand another round. But one thing about this negotiation, it just kept going on and on and on and on. But I think now with the 10th anniversary of KORUS, I think we finally have moved on, and we need to work together on other issues that are critical, not only to our bilateral economic relationship, but to the region and globally.
Maybe I could pick up on that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, on that. Well, of course, our negotiation only took about 1 year, right?
Right.
8 rounds of official round and plus that many intercessioners. 1 intercessioner here in San Francisco, because I like this city.
Right. So I knew he'd only meet with me if when I had stuff to ask. Oh, let's come to San Francisco, and he'd be like, "I'm getting on the plane," only to find out that I had, some proposals that you kind of didn't like.
Right.
Yeah.
So negotiation only took 1 year, but bringing it to respective Congress and asking the approval took us almost 5 years. That process was really tedious, slow, and difficult. Handling with the different people. Not my counterpart, So that was much more difficult, process. Pretty much politically charged. And this auto issue, that I tried to mention after the negotiation. Everything is concluded. And even Korean part has submitted our own documents to our own National Assembly. This text should be approved by you. And we did that in 2008. And in 2009, your administration changed it from President Bush to President Obama. And at that time, your car makers were in a very difficult situation after Wall Street financial crisis, and they were the subject of bailout programs. So that was bad times for President Obama. But anyhow, we should sit together again to rewrite on that part of the text. For us, what I have to do was to withdraw all the text I have already submitted to our National Assembly. And that was really politically difficult, and renegotiated, and with a new text, submit again for approval. So that was really difficult times for us, for me.
Well, let's not renegotiate. Let's talk about the future of U.S.-Korea kind of economic cooperation with this foundation of the FTA of KORUS. Maybe I can start with you, Wendy, on kind of what you see as the opportunities using the foundation for U.S.-Korea cooperation bilaterally, but then also multilaterally, and then to you, Minister Kim.
So when I look at the pressing economic issues as a result of, geopolitical developments, particularly the U.S.-China relationship, you look at the pandemic, you look at the supply chain disruptions, and now Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the set of economic challenges that are facing our governments are a bit different than they were during KORUS. I mean, market access is still important, and opening markets is important, increasing investment ties is important, but the whole issue of kind of economic security, resilient supply chains, dealing with the effects of climate on trade, and dealing with new technologies and what restrictions should be placed on them. These are all kind of the issues. Many of them fall under this umbrella of what we call economic security now. And this is really the economic agenda of the Biden administration. And as a result, they have entered into a number of kind of bilateral initiatives with countries like Korea to work on supply chains, to work on, for example, on batteries and semiconductors, where Korea is a key supplier and manufacturer, but also to work on standards for advanced technologies. So bilaterally, we're working on these issues. But furthermore, the Biden administration has unveiled its new economic initiative for the Indo-Pacific region called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the IPEF. This is not a trade agreement. Trade is one component of this agreement, but the objective is to work on those issues, including supply chains, decarbonization, anti-corruption, labor, digital trade, environment, and a couple of other issues. And that's what we're working on now with Korea and 12 other countries. Korea has been a really early supporter of our work here, and we're extremely grateful to Korea. Korea helped the United States attract other partners to this initiative. and is helping us kind of work through the substance of what do we want to achieve in all of these areas. Because while in the trade area, we have more guidance and we know, based on what we've done before, we keep building on what we've done. For example, on digital trade, the United States has agreements with Canada and Mexico, but also with Japan. And so I think a lot of what we'll do in IPEF on digital trade will lift some of what we've done already, but add some new features as well. But in areas like supply chains, this is really new, uncharted territory. And what do we want to do when we work with other countries on supply chains? So on one level, you can say, yes, let's build resilient supply chains. But what does that really mean? And that's what the negotiators are trying to figure out right now. I think one feature already that has been mentioned by Secretary Raimondo is what she calls an early warning system. And that is where governments would notify other governments that they're working with that guess what, something big is happening in our, we expect to have a major supply chain disruption as a result of this drought or as a result of, some other weather condition. Or, I don't know, a month or two ago, Korea had a strike by your truckers, and that also was very disruptive to Korea's shipments and supply and supply chain. So by an early warning mechanism, you're alerting the other countries, so then you can work together to see how you can alleviate the pain that will be created by these supply chain disruptions. So that's just one example. But these are the kind of issues that are going to be on the agenda going forward, and I think ones that are really ripe for U.S.-Korea cooperation bilaterally, but also regionally through the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and frankly also in the multilateral context in the World Trade Organization.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Wendy. Minister Kim.
Well, let me tell you on 2 points and on 2 different time frames. Number one, when President Trump, wants some part of the agreement to be revised, my expectation was really kind of work with the United States on digital economy. Of course, in our agreement, what we have done, we have e-commerce there, but that is a very early stage of a digital economy. And now we have a CPTPP and USMCA, much more elaborated, clauses and text on digital economy. So that may be a good chance. That was my expectation. But U.S. side was only focused on autos and autos and autos. So I really missed that opportunity. But again, if we go into a kind of cooperation in future, that may be a good area because we do understand what would be the future industry for both of us. Number one. Number two, speaking about, telling about supply chain, the reason why we are concerned about supply chain, because the chains are broken. Chains are broken here and there. Why? That's not because of economic reasons. Many of the reasons are geopolitical. And geopolitics is not the responsibility or, any businessman cannot be accountable for that. Businessmen are focusing on economic interest. But geopolitics, what they call geopolitics, is a relationship between countries. That's a state affair. So as far as the supply chain is concerned, state has much role to play. And once they do believe that the parties are broken here, and under that prepositions, they have to look for another good solid supply chain. That's what I understand as it is described as a policy of IPEF, whatever the name may be. So once we really share the view that international division of work, as it worked in the times of globalization, and once that is now a past story, not anymore an ongoing history, then we have to look for replacing ideas. That's economic security. And that's why we are concerning about that. you know. So, as I told in a smaller group there, Korean new government, we are ready to cooperate with countries who can share the same fundamental values, like liberal democracy, market economy, respect for human rights, and rule of law. That will be the foundation of our cooperation. With those countries, there is plenty of room to cooperate, to construct a solid supply chain. So that will be a good part of our future cooperation.
Thanks so much. We've got some time for questions. If folks could raise their hand, and I'll call on you, and if you could say your name and your question, and maybe we'll take a couple of them at a time and then give our speakers some time to respond.
Hi, I'm Larry Greenwood, a member of the Asia Society of Northern California and a friend and former colleague of both Wendy and James. I guess my question is to Minister Kim. You mentioned that one of the things that Korea wanted out of the chorus was essentially protection against, you didn't use the word arbitrary, but I will, arbitrary trade actions under various aspects of our trade law, Super 301, 301, Section 232, et cetera. But you didn't get that, since when President Trump came in, he did use 232, the national security aspect, to restrict imports of Korean steel and aluminum. Did you feel that that was, I don't want to say betrayal, but what was your reaction to that? Because that is obviously one thing that Korea wanted out of this agreement, but did they get it? And are you worried about the integrity of the agreement because of that action?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Good question. Maybe we could just take one or two more, and then we can have you all answer them. Thanks, Larry. While the audience is thinking of their questions, I'm just going to throw one in there on something that I think occupies a lot of folks here in the Bay Area, which is the China relationship and the U.S.-China relationship, and how you see Korea and the United States addressing what's happening in China and China's impact on supply chains, on other aspects of technology. I think our audience would be interested in that.
Hello, I'm a student. You guys mentioned semiconductors as an industry that you guys want to work together, and I want to hear your comments on, say, Korean or U.S. reliance on China for strategic minerals as well as rare earth elements. Thank you.
So I think we've got three sets of questions. There was Larry's on whether or not the U.S.-Korea FTA really protected Korea from arbitrary U.S. action in the case of the 232s. And then there are two questions on how rare earths and minerals and China fits in the supply chain, and then a broader question about where China fits in with U.S.-Korea relations, on how they each look at economics. Maybe I could start with you, Wendy, and then finish with you, Minister Kim. Would that be all right?
Can I take the 232 question? I'll let you. I think he's going to have stronger language than a betrayal. So, supply chains. And again, we've seen a lot of disruption in supply chains. And, some of this is due to geopolitical tension. But I think also the pandemic and climate, weather conditions, has also really underscored and revealed a lot of vulnerabilities and choke points in our supply chains. And so companies, the supply chain officer in companies who for years probably no one paid attention to, it's probably one of the most important jobs now, because it's very, for most products, there are, lots and lots of inputs. And so everyone's interested, how do you reduce these vulnerabilities? And for the Biden administration, one of the first acts they took was to conduct a 100-day study of 4 critical supply chain products, including, as you mentioned, critical minerals, but it also included pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and batteries. And in all of these areas, they really delved into our vulnerabilities. But more importantly, the studies provided a roadmap of how to reduce our vulnerabilities. And in the rare earths critical minerals area, we are extremely dependent on China. And it's interesting, it's not because of the mining, because we have a lot of those minerals in the United States, but it's not the actual minerals, it's getting those minerals out of the ground. And that's very expensive and it's environmentally harmful. And as a result, we don't do that in the United States. China has become, the major processor of these minerals, and we've become very dependent on them, which is of great concern because these minerals are not only used for things like electric vehicle batteries, but they're also used for defense applications. And so in all of these areas, semiconductors, batteries, pharmaceuticals, and critical minerals, these reports underscored our vulnerabilities. And the administration, is pursuing policies that I would kind of put in a few buckets. One would be to increase U.S. manufacturing in these sectors and try and attract the supply chains to reshore some of these supply chains back to the United States. Second is more kind of focus on stockpiling or building up inventories. Now, cost-wise, this may not be the best approach, but I think the feeling is, particularly during the pandemic, when we found ourselves without important personal protective equipment and ventilators, et cetera, we recognized that a lot of our federal stockpiles of these products was non-existent or frankly outdated. But then importantly, and I think this is the area that gets back to kind of what we've been talking about today, we can't make everything in the United States, nor should we. So therefore, if we want to rely our dependence on China and let's say other countries that we don't feel that it's in our interest to be reliant on, we need to work with our allies and partners and like-minded countries to build what are called secure or trusted supply chains. And I think that's where, in particular, Korea comes in the picture with respect to batteries and semiconductors. With respect to rare earths and critical minerals, Australia's a very important partner. But in all of these sectors, there's going to be a different group of countries that we'll want to work with to lessen our dependence on China. But this can't happen overnight. And so this is a longer-term endeavor. And it's interesting, China also is looking at where it over-relies on the United States for certain products, because it also feels vulnerable and at the whim of U.S. sanctions or U.S. decisions to kind of withhold exports of the product. So it's no coincidence that China is really ramping up, for example, its semiconductor production. So we are seeing a world now where countries and companies really want to diversify their supply chains for a whole host of reasons and want to become either more self-reliant or find those group of companies or countries that they're more comfortable working with and feel that they can rely on, and where there won't be as many disruptions.
Minister Kim, supply chains and betrayal, please.
Yes, all right, okay. Well, first by responding to the first questions. Yes, we have an old saying in Korea, and maybe in US too, good medicines is not sweet. It is always sour, or very difficult to swallow. The demand of market opening, whether an item or an area from US, finally turns out to be good for Korean economy. Whether that was a cookie, banana, IP, whatever. So that raised up the standard of Korean economy as a system. But that was the result after some years later. But at the very front earlier time, whenever there's issues, there's reactions from the interest group, and that was true. One example, maybe I don't know whether you have ever heard about cod head. Cod is a fish, and head, cod head. That issue was issue between our two countries for more than 10 years in the past, not now. Why it was the issue? Koreans are eating cod head, while Americans don't serve it for human consumption. They always, garbage. So one American fisherman came to know that, Koreans are eating this cod head, and they try to sell it. And the reaction from the Korean public, through a kind of media introduction, that Americans are trying to sell their trash or garbage to our public. That was a pure sentimental response. So that issue remained for more than 10 years, and I was there as an economic counselor in our embassy in U.S. in D.C. And I tried, I found finally the solutions that U.S. Customs Office, made a kind of descriptions in their note. The cod head can be served to human consumption, provided that it was cut in certain way, something like that. And after that was published officially, that dispute is disappeared. Such kind of thing. So that's why we have never say about 301 or cod head again. After the EIF of Korea's FTA. But one thing, in our agreement also we have a dispute settlement process, and there's a dispute settlement kind of type, what they call ISDS, which was a really politically charged topic at the moment of Korean National Assembly's approval on this agreement, because some of the politicians said this means the desertion of a judicial sovereignty. ISDS, investor-state dispute, and there should be a panel by 3 persons representing each side, and that replaces all the judicial process. So they say we have our own judicial systems, and all these are overridden by this kind of ISDS in a agreement. So in that sense, they say this is a desertion of judicial sovereignty. And that was a very difficult time to persuade them that many countries are adopting their systems. So something. But anyhow, it is true. Once we adopted this Korea's FTA, U.S. has ever done about Super 301 or 301, except the 232, what President Trump has tried to apply. And that issue still remains about Korean steel, under a strong quota control under 232, Section 232. And that's not a part of Korea's agreement, but that's a trade issue which should be solved sooner or later. And coming to supply chain, yes, well, I agree to Wendy, and particularly on rare earth and strategic minerals. We are heavily dependent on China. I looked at a certain survey and research studies about 200 something, very strategically important minerals. Almost 80% are from China, for Korean business. So that's a very heavy dependence on China. And we can think about kind of downstream management, But I keep saying the importance of we have to do something in upstream. Wendy has mentioned, already about exploring or mining. Well, we try to, but Korea is a small land. This kind of rare earth is really is under the big land like U.S., Brazil, Argentina, Australia, India, or sometimes in Russia. And even though Korean people dig our own land, there's no rare earth. That's the problem. So we really need a kind of partnership here. We bring our investment to manufacture, semiconductors and batteries for EVs and everything, and with a huge investment. And maybe we need a kind of, in return, kind of measures from our good partners, which is the U.S., who have a big land. Or we do understand you have your own problem, environmental, and the expenses to mining them. But we have to think this is good time to think about real kind of a partnership. Once China try to tighten their pipeline on certain rare earth, then no matter how good technologies and big equipment we have in manufacturing, if materials are not there, then we cannot go ahead with our productions. So what a real important partnership means, we have to think about.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. Really, congratulations to our two leaders who put this agreement into getting it in front of our respective assemblies. I hope to have you guys both back in 10 years, that we can celebrate the 20th anniversary of the U.S.-Korea FTA. You've given us a lot to chew on going forward for both the U.S. and Korea in the region and globally. Please join me in thanking our panelists and the Asia Society of Northern California for hosting us.
Thank you.
Yes, our thanks to Wendy, Minister Kim, James, Consul General Yoon, and everyone at the Consul General of the Republic of Korea in San Francisco. It was really special to hear the background negotiation stories between the two of you in this historic hotel in San Francisco, and thank you, James, for moderating that discussion. Please check our Asia Society Northern California website for our upcoming programs. We have events coming up on U.S.-China, Asia through COVID and climate change, Abe's legacy in Japan, the future of the digital world order, and data and ethical AI in Southeast Asia. We're hosting events weekly, in person in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, and virtually for our global audience. We do request your help for this program today. On your seat, you should have all received one of these. Thank you to the consulate. It's a post-event survey with a QR code, so if you can take a moment to fill it out, your feedback is very important to us. We love hearing from you. If you're not already an Asia Society member, please join us. If you would like to sponsor any of our programs, please do so as well. Again, the video will be made available in about a week on our website. Good luck to the delegation visiting us from Korea. Thank you again to the Korea Consulate, to Consul General Yoon, Consul Yoon, and the whole team. And to our team, can you guys stand up, please? We have Angela Chung, Natalie Despigliere, Rex Laui, Nina Udagawa, and Jenny Kai. Thank you to our interns and volunteers as well. And on behalf of Asia Society Northern California, thank you for joining us.